In the spirit of a revitalized and slightly changing CyFy, I'm going to let you know that we are actually going to give the audience the first word in this panel. So right after I give my introduction of the panelists and a couple thoughts, if there's anyone who feels really strongly about aspects of this, we will take up to 3 comments from the floor to kick us off. So that's your warning in case you want to be one of those 3. I am delighted to be moderating this panel. I think it's an exciting one based off of recent events and some of the core issues that we're concerned about in this area. We've got 4 great panelists with us today. Starting from my right, I've got Phil Lark, the director of the program on cybersecurity studies at the Marshall Center in Germany, in Garmisch. To his right, I have Jane Holl Lute, former Deputy Secretary of the United States Department of Homeland Security and a commissioner on the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. Next, I have Alex Klimburg, Director of the Cyber Policy and Resiliency Program at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies and author of the recently acclaimed book, The Darkening Web. And then fourth at the end, I have James Owen, Senior Partner leading the South Asia practice for control risks. So I'm delighted you're all able to join us. You won't actually be hearing much from me substantively. A lot of my thoughts on this topic are in the article entitled Hacking Democracy that is in the compendium Digital Debates, which is available and that was presented to the ministers yesterday. So I've been working on this topic for most of the year and my thoughts are in print for you. What I would like to do though is just introduce a couple thoughts here. First, I want to build off of what Carl Bildt said yesterday afternoon. What is so new about interfering in other countries' political systems and elections? I can go back and find discussion of that in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, and Carl gave us some great examples from the 20th century. So ask yourselves, what is substantively or qualitatively different? Why are we having this discussion? Number 2, if we are confronted with the fact that countries are meddling in each other's political processes, including electoral processes, and if we aren't completely certain that everything that's happening in our elections is entirely appropriate in our own, in your domestic system, then I'm going to pose the very pejorative question, what degree of uncertainty in an election process is acceptable to still maintain legitimacy of that? Do we actually believe that the count of votes in any election in a country as large as India or the United States is absolutely accurate down to the very ones column of that vote tally? If you don't believe that, then you're accepting some degree of uncertainty. How much are you willing to tolerate and still have legitimacy in your democracy? And that brings me to my third introductory thought, is are we facing a situation where we have to balance or make trade-offs between our core democratic values? These are all ideas that we want in their absolute pure form, but can we actually have them simultaneously? We've heard about the discussion and the trade-off or conflict between privacy and national security in the surveillance discussions and the encryption discussions. We've heard about trade-offs between the rule of law and freedom of expression in the censorship conversations. Well, in the context of elections, I want to ask you if there is a necessary trade-off between the fundamental concept of freedom and the fundamental concept of equality. In voting, we have this principle of one person, one vote. In talking about voting, do we want to have a limitation of one person, one voice? Or can you have a multitude of voices in social media? Should companies be allowed unlimited investments in television and radio ads during elections? In most countries, there's a limit to broadcast media by a voice. Right now, there is no limit to a voice in social media and on the internet. I'm not advocating for limits, but I'm asking you, we've made balancing between freedom and equality in campaign finance and in broadcast media Do you want to extend those principles, or do you want to have other areas of our public dialogue where there is no limitation to how loud a voice can be, or even identifying who that voice may be? So with those teasers, is there anyone in the audience who'd like to be a part of giving the first word? If so, come to one of the microphones, please. And I'm going to ask you to keep your intervention to about 1 minute, but let's hear what the audience is thinking. We'll start with the gentleman on the left, and then we'll come to the gentleman on the right. And if there are any ladies in the audience who are interested, please be my third comment. Can we get that microphone working for the gentleman?
Good morning. I am Isaac from Uganda. I have one question to the entire panelists. And my question comes in based on the country where I come from. I think one of the challenges we have for democracy and encryption and hacking of our democratic processes is transparency. One of the reasons as to why people generally will sit and ask questions concerning whether the elections have been hacked is when people don't believe in the democratization process. Are there things that we could do to increase on the transparency so that when we talk about democracy, it being free and fair, or if it's hacked, and we have evidence that we can prove? One of the challenges we have with governments is they will tell us it's been hacked, they don't provide us with evidence, and they want us to believe. What's your take on that?
Thank you. Very good comment. Gentleman in the front.
Hello. Hello. I'm Professor Mehrotra. I deal with all IP networks and all those with my students and post-engineering students and all those. Also indulges in policy. Now a couple of questions. I was in media also. There are a couple of things very interesting, what you gave the third comment. Basically the TV, it rules the mind of the common man. And we have seen the history where the TV, using the TV, they have changed the politics of the countries. And you know, I should not name the things. It happened in the UK many times. It happened during the Gulf War. It created a phobia, what to do and what not to do. And that's why there was a question, well, how much media ownership I should give it, vertical media ownership. But if I look at the social media, there is no connectivity with that. Now the question is that how we are going to tackle the entire thing. It is necessary to do, because I will not like to get social fabrics of my country to be broken by foreigners, by anybody else. I must remain Indian, I'm Indian. Same way the UK and US, any country in the world. So we should not allow the things to happen to be broken. It is acceptability. Now the question is that, yesterday we talked about United Nations should play a bigger game to do that. Again, in our vested interest, we kept the internet open, so open that is eating us again back to us. There is an ITU, International Telecommunication Organization. This organization, a part of the United Nations. Why don't we allow them to play around? Because that says the sovereign nations, they have to do the things. The entire telecom is dealt by that, but internet, we wanted to keep it away. So why don't we do that? I would like to get your comments on that.
Thank you very much. I don't see any ladies who've joined. I'll take the gentleman on the far left, and then I see a couple other hands, but we're going to go to our panel, and the three gentlemen with their hands up, I will come back to you for priority when we come back to the audience later. Sir.
Thanks, and sorry I'm not a woman. One of the most, I think, insightful comments I heard in recent weeks is we have to differentiate between the attack and the attacker. And so applying this to the panel today, I'd like to ask, I live in the US right now, and I see much of the reaction to the recent operation against the US election focused on the attacker and not a lot on the attack. And so my question for the panel would be, what is it that we can do to decrease our susceptibility to this kind of attacks, whoever the attacker is?
And Hugo, you didn't properly identify yourself, and for the audience's benefit, you are French, yes, living in the US. Tell me your thought regarding the allegations about interventions in the French election as well. Same comments, or?
Same comment, but I would argue that in the French case, one of the things that arguably decreased the impact of the attack was that there was a ban on how the media reported on the attack that was made. So the attack was on the Friday before the election. That was on a Sunday, and the Saturday was blackout of the national media. And
Can I use the word censorship?
If you want to. In this case, it's legal. So.
All right. Thank you very much for those introductory comments. We're going to come to our panelists now, and I assure you we're going to leave a lot of time because I want this to be a dialogue with the audience. We've got some great perspectives represented here, and I'd like to start with Jane Holl Lute to tell us a little bit about the particulars of electoral systems and what we're talking about here and why it's so critical.
Thanks, Sean. Good morning, everyone. How many people here vote regularly? That's actually really reassuring. People who do not vote, don't raise your hands. You will be vote shamed. How many believe your vote matters? Those of you who believe your vote, you vote. How many believe your vote matters? What if it didn't? And what if you couldn't have confidence that your vote mattered? What are we facing really? We're facing an environment now, and what's different, Carl Bildt said, nothing's new. Governments have been trying to influence each other's elections openly and covertly for centuries, millennia, perhaps. We've all been trying to influence each other's behaviors in our everyday lives, in every facet of our everyday lives. What's different now? Certainly what's different is the internet and the pervasiveness of the internet in our everyday lives. Our reliance on IT and access to the internet is complete. We take our news there. We get up in the morning relying on our phones that are tied to the internet. We talk to our families. We do everything online. And there's no enterprise in any of our marketplaces that delivers value, not one, that delivers value without relying on IT and access to the internet. And governments don't govern at all anymore effectively without reliance on IT and access to the internet. And I'd be interested in your color commentary on that when we get to the discussion. So our reliance is complete. We're living in an age, really, of a global cyber awakening, where a global population is already healthier, wealthier, more mobile, more educated, and more engaged in its civic and commercial selves than ever before. And that global cyber awakening is intersecting with a near total collapse of trust in public sector institutions. People don't trust businesses, they don't trust banks, they don't trust the media, they don't trust markets, and increasingly they don't trust their governments. Where are they turning to for their information? And one of the processes that governments rely on for their legitimacy and for their discourse with the publics they serve is the electoral process. And what if we can't have confidence in that process? What if the act of registering voters were interfered with? What if the tallying of votes was corrupted? What if we really couldn't have confidence that the results that are reported in the outcomes of elections are the true results of the choices made by the people? So especially for governments, the stakes are high. The stakes are very, very high. We need governments to provide basic threshold conditions of security, well-being, and justice, and at every turn, their competence and our confidence is undermined. How are we going to deal with this? One would think that governments would be in complete agreement about the priority and importance of preserving that fundamental process that we who live in democracies all believe in, that there is no more fundamental political right than a say in how you are governed. And if the process for effecting that say is corrupt or suspect, then where do we begin? Much less, where do we go from here? There is not unanimous agreement that protection of our electoral systems is vital. That's shocking. Governments can't agree that this ought to be a priority issue around which they can mobilize. So we have a global cyber awakening, a public more educated, informed, and active, and governments really on the downswing of trust globally. And people are angry. We see it everywhere around the globe. This is anger, social anger that we're seeing. And that anger will extend to the lack of confidence in the electoral systems by which our governments are in place. No one can afford to be complacent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to next turn to Alex, please.
Thank you, Sean. Quick question. Are we going to return to those questions from beforehand, after? Around?
Absolutely, and if there's particular things you'd like to comment on, feel free to address some of those
I'll
initial
save it
thoughts
for
as
later,
well.
but those were great questions, and we should talk about them. So I'm a cyber guy like many of you, so I approached this from a cyberspace operations point of view, and I think it's helpful to step back a little bit and look at what we're dealing with. So from a technical point of view, we sometimes look at cyber attacks as technical issues, and the worst possible outcome is cyber war. But there's another way of looking at this, another doctrine of looking at this, that looks at all of information attacks as psychological attacks, and the worst possible outcome is information warfare. Now, as Carl and others have pointed out, information warfare and psychological operations are as old as war altogether. But I would like to caution the comparisons with psychological operations today and on the internet with those of the 1980s or before. Manipulating social media and using botnets and similar activity to effectively steer public opinion is not the same thing as sending photocopiers to Eastern Europe, or indeed the activities of Voice of America and similar. And the reason for this is simply something I would call the internet observer bias, if you want to look at quantum physics for an example. So what this means is, though, is for those of us who do cyber operations, when we look at cyber attacks, we sometimes misunderstand what we're seeing. We look at something and we think, how is this violating the data, the confidentiality, the integrity, or the availability of data? And we concentrate on that as our point of departure. But sometimes data is not the purpose of a cyber attack. The narrative is the purpose. And this is something that we get confused quite often. We see cyber operations, but in fact we're seeing information warfare operations. And this is part of the challenge, because this is happening within the information domain, where everything we do and we see changes the nature of that domain. So take as an example the French TV station TV5 in April of 2015. In April of 2015, they were hacked, they went offline, all 6 of their channels went offline for days. It emerged in 2016 that they were actually nearly destroyed as a company. What happened immediately afterwards is that a cyber jihadi group claimed responsibility. They proclaimed allegiance to ISIS, and suddenly we finally had cyber terrorism. For the first time in 15 years of public debate on this, we finally had a real case of cyber terrorism. Somebody had used the internet to cause kinetic damage, and it wasn't the state. And this was coming at a time where in Europe we were discussing the first piece of European legislation on cybersecurity, the Network Information Security Directive. And suddenly people were using the term cyber terrorism instead of the term that we usually use, terrorist use of the internet, to discuss this issue. And that did have an impact, I can tell you, on the debate within the European Union itself. The joke is that it emerged only a couple of weeks after the event had occurred, and the cyber terrorist narrative was already established, that according to the French government leaking to the media, it wasn't in fact cyber jihadis, it was a group called APT-28, which is commonly affiliated with Russian military intelligence. So what were they doing hacking a French TV station, taking it offline? And the only possible explanation from my point of view and those of others is that they were interested in steering this narrative at a very crucial period within the European Union's time. And this is not the only example of a narrative being steered by cyber attacks. If you look back to just NotPetya and even WannaCry, you can see that activities occur that make no sense from a cyber operations point of view. NotPetya, for instance, had no purpose in terms of making money. You couldn't actually pay to get yourself off in NotPetya. It was not possible. It was literally for one purpose only, and that was for destruction. Why is that occurring? And from my point of view, this is part of the internet observer bias problem, is that when we conduct operations in cyberspace, we are not only changing political outcomes, for instance, we're potentially changing the nature of the internet itself. And that is something which for some governments is probably something to be keenly interested in, because the present model of internet governance does not suit their needs. From their point of view, the worst possible outcome is not necessarily cyber warfare with destroyed critical infrastructure, it's regime change and revolution, and them putting against the, and them physically being shot, perhaps as a result. This is why we need to come back to some of these operations that we're seeing today, in particular the ones I've described recently, that have no other purpose than to draw attention to security problems on the internet and potentially influence internet governance debate, and ask us, where is this all leading? And I am somewhat concerned that information warfare will change governments, will influence political elections, will impact democracies. But I am terrified that it will change the internet in entirety. So recent events in the UK and elsewhere have shown that governments can shift policy very quickly when they talk about internet freedoms and how we've actually come to view the internet that we value so much today. And it might happen that we have an incident in the next year or two, an incident that is branded as cyber terrorism, and suddenly the entire discourse on the internet would radically shift its direction. And if that happens, there'll be very little room for free speech at all, because the government's never had a role on the internet. When Arun talked about the internet are claiming the internet back, I agree with part of that. Governments are claiming the internet, but they can't have it back because they didn't create it. The US government financed it through academic programs and similar, but it was created by the civil society and it's owned mostly by the private sector. Governments can blow things up and they can listen in on things, but they don't create things on the internet. And if they take control over the internet, which is definitely the interest of some actors, it won't be the vehicle, it won't be the domain that we have today.
Thank you, Alex. I'd like to stay at that end and turn to James next, who has great experience in India and can also hopefully provide us a little of the private sector perspective. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Sean. So I think it's fair to say right now that India is at a fairly unique place in terms of its overall digital journey. Aadhaar, the world's largest biometric database, is being rolled out. There's a multitude of e-governance initiatives through Digital India. The government currently has the pretty amazing goal of achieving 25 billion transactions this year, a move that is clearly emboldened by demonetization, and the goods and services tax will, amongst other things, require companies to upload their invoices onto the cloud. The ambition is impressive. There's lots of stuff going on, but the challenges are pretty sizable, not least because India right now lacks a really credible and robust data security policy framework. I think the size of the challenge is also pretty unique for anywhere in the world right now, in that India is seeking to digitize and secure information for over 1.3 billion content owners. So it's a sizable task. What does this mean for companies in the private sector? Well, it essentially means that they need to get on top of their risk exposure. Increasing connectivity is good for business, but it also increases your attack surface. That's why companies need to put in place a holistic approach to enterprise risk management. That's why they need to put in place mitigation measures in relation to training and appropriate technical responses. The approach also needs to be strategic rather than tactical. It needs to be informed by a careful assessment of, I guess, the risk-reward equation of determining whether you seek to engage in a particular market, in a particular sector, if you decide to engage with a particular joint venture partner, or indeed actually pursue a particular transaction. Many companies, I think it's still fair to say, see data security through the prism of infrastructure rather than from the perspective of seeking to ensure they know what data they need to secure within their own organization, whether that is payroll, HR, or pricing data. And actually, in our own cyber business in Asia, we've seen a real uptick in the last few months in cyber attacks specifically targeting pricing data, including in markets like China, and often where there is a state-owned enterprise that is also involved in a particular tender. So companies, given that, also need to understand the broader threat environment. The main weakness for any company is not its IT infrastructure. Computers don't attack people, it's the people behind the system. So informing your decision-making by getting a really firm grasp on the motivations and the capabilities of the threat actors that you have, whether those are nation states, whether those are criminals, or whether those are activists, is really at the very center of creating a robust cyber resilience policy for any company. From a threat perspective, social media is still primarily leveraged by activists, often in a relatively low-tech way to build momentum around a particular ideology or a particular attack they are planning to make. And we're increasingly seeing more of this in India and, of course, elsewhere, where the central goal is a very public humiliation of a company for its alleged failings. In these situations, social media obviously acts as something of a soapbox, as a way to attract attention, and sometimes even to blur attribution, as we saw with Sony and North Korea. A focus on social media, often a low sophistication attack vector, shouldn't actually disguise, though, the real challenge related to dealing with serious criminal attacks. And we've already heard yesterday and this morning about the attacks on the NHS in the UK, and likewise in relation to the DNC in the United States last year. Companies like national governments really need to be proactive as possible in putting in place prevention strategies. It's all about thinking about prevention. And I would say they also need to think about the big picture, especially when it comes to the geopolitics of cybersecurity and how that essentially shapes the risk environment. It's probably no coincidence that only a couple of months ago, just as there was a contretemps, a dispute on the border up on the Dockland Plateau between Delhi and Beijing, that the government announced the requirements for all smartphone manufacturers and creators of internet browsers, most of whom are Chinese companies, that they need to sign up to a security audit to ensure that the data that they maintain on Indian citizens is actually secure. I think the timing of that was instructive and obviously comes relatively hot on the heels of the decision by the Indian government earlier this year to prevent Chinese companies operating in the power grid in India as well. It's a bit of a cliche, but I think it's fair to say that India is increasingly seeing data as oil. It certainly produces enough of it to fit that description, and probably justifiably wants to get a much better grip on where its data is going to, especially where that data is leaving its own national borders. And let's face it, most Indian data does leave its national borders and in most cases ends up on servers in the United States. So just to sum up quickly, I think from my point of view in the work that we support companies with in India and around the world, it's all about prevention and education. And I think that is relevant for companies and governments alike. And I think it's particularly relevant in an Indian context, because right now you have a situation where the government is seeking to really make a success of the world's largest biometric identification project, at the same time as balancing that with the need to ensure that it's taking account of what is now enshrined as privacy, which is now enshrined as a kind of right by the Supreme Court, or to put it another way, the right to actually be left alone. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, James. Next, I'd like to turn to Phil Lark. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Well, I want to thank the panelists for sort of really bringing together all the issues that are a real challenge for all of us to address. The biggest things that I sort of see are the speed, the complexity, and sort of combination of technical challenges that the attacks that come to us, the strategy and policy differences that we have, and yet on a global connected space where we're seeing the same effects, but through culture, where we are, where we live, the rules, laws, and regulations that we have in place, it's difficult for us to share information. And to me, this is, I think, the biggest challenge that we have, where we could be sharing what those threat attacks are, the vectors, learning from different systems and things that worked, that didn't, and worked and have not worked, because these type of attacks, information operations, influence operations, are happening globally. They get reported more in the United States, in Europe, and in India, but they're happening in Africa, they're happening on small Pacific islands, and manifesting themselves in different ways. So I sort of see this technical portion of identifying threat vectors is one thing that has to be addressed. There's a strategy and policy confluence where we can learn from each other in terms of sharing what possibilities are there. But I sort of see the real challenge is getting the right information to the right decision makers so that we can start addressing some of these challenges. in particular, in our research that we've done, our research that we've done in Africa and Central Asia is just sharing what experiences that have happened and done it in a way that is culturally relevant. So just getting technical cybersecurity experts to share threat vector information is only one step. How do we inform decision makers, policy makers, legislatures to get the right tools in place that allow comprehensive whole of government responses? And to do this within a framework of knowing that the adversaries can conduct influence operations quickly, they can use the same methods and approaches many times over and over, and to prepare these influence operations, to prepare information operations well in advance of when they want them to take place. You can go ahead and buy Twitter accounts, Facebook accounts, social media accounts on the dark web, prepare them to go ahead and respond well in advance of an activity. So with adversaries that can prepare in splendid isolation to prepare themselves to achieve a particular effect, we are really helpless, certainly as government professionals, as academics and researchers, to address these challenges quickly and for us to be able to counter them. We can learn from experiences of the American elections recently, what's happened in the Ukraine in 2014 with potential operations in Montenegro, and on and on and on. But how do we share information from these experiences with the professionals that have to respond? Whether it's private industry, whether it's academia, whether it's government professionals such as myself. I'll tell you, it's a real challenge. And how do we start? I don't think it's a role for government. Certainly, I think private industry is the network and thread that has a certain role that can help us address some of these challenges. And we've seen private industry, social media companies, cybersecurity companies, information security companies help lead the effort. But still, there's some big challenges for government officials. And let's take Jane's sort of approach where she talked about election security. So in the United States, there are about 9,000 jurisdictions that conduct elections. How do we help those 9,000 different jurisdictions learn from each other? There are certainly different rules and procedures that they have, equipment that they're using, tabulation methods. And this is just complex in the United States to try to get this right because local governments run elections. So maybe some things that we've learned can be applicable elsewhere. But in other countries that run national level campaigns, how could they share information as well? As you can see, there are not just one organization doing this, there's many. We need advocates to talk about information and influence operations within their own specialties and share information with others that they don't think need the information, but they do. And this complexity is necessary to be addressed rapidly. We don't have the convenience of dragging this out for years to try to figure this out through broad international organizations. I think the help of individuals, corporations, and governments working together to address some of these challenges is necessary. But thankfully, we've had good researchers who have given us the high points to go ahead and start addressing. But the speed and rapidity of information operations done by states and non-state actors is only going to increase. It's only going to get more complex. And as we look at identifying what those potential activities have on critical infrastructure, and in particular, election critical infrastructure, we all have to take action. Everyone has a role to do this. And with that, I think Hugo's points on, instead of focusing on the attackers, let's focus on the attacks, I think is very relevant. We have to, focus on methods and sharing best practices and information, and less so on the attackers, because we can speculate on what their objectives are, but if the objectives are just for disruption, they're pretty effective. So let's go ahead and transition to answering maybe some of those great questions.
Yeah, thank you, and that's exactly where we're going to go. I want to come back to those 3 initial questions, and I'm actually going to start with Phil and Alex, because you weighed in on this, and I want to work off of Hugo's question, the U.S. election, French presidential election. Alex, you talked about the TV Monde example, so let me pose it this way, and feel free to elaborate, but I'll pose the question, did France respond rightly? And how should the U.S. have responded, Phil? My understanding is we had media blackout, as Hugo explained. In the U.S., some Russian diplomats were expelled from the country. Are these things enough? What else should be done if we're trying to keep free and fair elections where we can have the confidence in our votes that Jane suggests we need? I invite Alex and Phil on this question, also James and Jane if you want, but I've got other questions for you as well.
Thanks. So the order of those questions was perfect, because for me it basically showed a story. You start with attacks and the needs for transparency and trust, which then leads to legitimacy in your actions at home, which lead to resiliency in dealing with information warfare attacks. It couldn't get better, but we didn't organize it, so this wasn't our own information warfare attack. Just to expand on what I mean right now, is that transparency and trust from an information security practitioner, from a technical person's point of view, is the beginning of all of this. So I would completely agree that one way to address a lot of the issues that we have currently in dealing with trust issues in government and similar is to start with transparency measures and talking about where attacks have occurred, accounting for the fact that we've suffered breaches that are embarrassing, and also perhaps accounting for the fact that we may be encouraging these breaches through our own offensive activities. So this type of transparency, I think, is long overdue. I think many governments, particularly in the West, who sign up to these types of values, should be much more aggressive in effectively laying out exactly what they mean in terms of offensive cyber operations, what they actually are meant to do, not the individual operations necessarily, but what the idea is behind them, so we can have an open and transparent discussion about that. That will also increase the trust of their own citizens, which also helps legitimacy of those governments when they, for instance, implement content control restrictions or intelligence gathering activities. To take one example, in Sweden, they had a long-running debate regarding the so-called FRA law. FRA is the Swedish NSA, and the FRA law was the law that was designed to effectively manage the bulk collection of intelligence. And it was a very wide-reaching law. The difference with the US approach was that in Sweden they discussed it publicly, widely, before the law was passed, and they ended up having a number of different control institutions to make the whole process more legitimate. So in the US they have the FISA court, which in Sweden they have 3 different courts and an ombudsman that was managing the process. And Sweden correspondingly had a much higher acceptance of this type of activity than many other nations would have automatically had. And that was because of legitimacy, I think, that the process brought in the eyes of its own citizens. And this brings us back to resilience, that as Jane said, when we're having this collapse of trust in public institutions, in the US case, 20% of the population think that the mainstream media is doing a good job, and only 6% think that the US Congress is doing a good job. When you're having numbers like that, what you really need to be doing, above all else, is effectively addressing the trust that underlies your relationship with those institutions. And that trust leads to resilience. I think that many countries in Europe suffered information warfare campaigns that were much more intense than those directed against the US in 2016, better because they had a higher level of trust in their institutions of government. That includes Scandinavia, in Sweden, in Finland, in Estonia, in Germany, as well as in France. And I think, therefore, that the resiliency issue, the resiliency as an answer to all of this really just starts with the trust and transparency elements that we talked about beforehand. And I think it's great that we're having this type of discussion and we can talk about how we can encourage this type of trust from governments going forward.
You didn't answer my question at all, but I think your comments were much better than my question, so thank you. Phil, did you want to weigh in on this one? And then
yes, I mean, my perspective is that there's much to be learned and shared with what has happened in some of these recent information influence campaigns, discussions and pointing at elections. If we look at Ukraine in 2014, in terms of how the attacks happened within their political parties and subsequently within the election results. And this sharing, though, seems to stop. stop within the national borders. And you know, I'm an advocate of there's much to be learned, especially with countries that have fragile electoral systems in the developing world. And how do we share this information? Is there a technical piece? You betcha there is. There's already a huge deficit of technical expertise, cybersecurity, and information security experts. If we put a blanket of election security over the top of just IT security and then maybe in a larger context cybersecurity, and focus it within just the lens of electoral operations, we are going to be challenged with just getting the right professionals to write, to share the information that they've learned, and to do it with, I guess, openness, because most people don't want to share the mistakes that they have sort of had and experienced. So I'm not sure I have a right answer to this, but there's something that needs to be done with this.
So I just want to address this question of transparency and just to sort of shake things up a little bit. I think it's overblown. And I say that coming from not only a political process and a culture that really believes in openness and transparency, but transparency in most people's hands usually means I get to know everything I want to know about whatever it is I want to know about. Well, that's really not transparency. And so if we're going to connect transparency to trust, I think we really need to be honest about it. One of the most trusted organizations on the planet is Apple Computer. Not exactly known for transparency. But why is it so trusted? Because it has a clear value proposition that is reliably delivered, on which many of us have come to depend, and we're not let down. So when you think about translating this expectation of transparency into government, or into governance, and into our societies, what are the elements that keep a highly heterogeneous society relatively stable? I think there are four, right? There are regularized voting, and that's what we're talking about. Can we have confidence in it? Transparent rulemaking, notwithstanding what I just said about transparency. Accessible redress and binding adjudication. Those four processes are institutionalized, and all of them, in one way or another, are under threat through our reliance on IT, access to the internet, and what malefactors out there are doing. I mean, Lotte Reddy spoke yesterday about basic cyber hygiene. We know what it is. We're not doing it. For electoral systems, what's the basic hygiene? Do we know what's connected to those networks and systems? Do we know what software is running on them or trying to run? Do we know who has access and administrative permissions to wander around these systems, whether they're voter registration systems, tallying systems, or otherwise? And do we have systems in place to alert us when things are going wrong so that we can patch those vulnerabilities? It is the biggest source of cyber insecurity today, unpatched vulnerabilities. We know these things, we're not doing them. And it is reached a crisis point, in my view, when it comes to electoral systems.
Thank you, and I was absolutely going to come back to you on the transparency one, so thank you for addressing that. I want to bring James back in and wondering if you can speak a little bit to the professor's comments about the different technologies that have come into the electoral world and legitimacy, and in particular, when we were talking before this panel, you had some thoughts on legitimacy and my question about uncertainty and percentages. I'd really appreciate if you could share that with this crowd.
Sure. I think the points around uncertainty in relation to an electoral result, I think you just need to define what we mean by uncertainty there. I think our tolerance to uncertainty is much lower, I would like to think, certainly as in my case, if an electoral system has been compromised, if it's been hacked, as in the case of allegedly the US elections last year. But equally, it's important to kind of differentiate where uncertainty is simply an outcome of a normal democratic process. In India, you are in one of the most robust and pluralistic democratic states in the world, and there is always uncertainty surrounding an election outcome, unless it was the 2014 elections when there was very little. A certain amount of uncertainty in relation to an election as a part of a normal democratic process is clearly understandable. And in fact, if you were to take the Australia example where they have compulsory voting, I think the tolerance for a high degree of uncertainty would increase exponentially, because actually you'll find if you don't turn up at the ballot box to actually cast your vote. I would also say that, given Russia is at the center of a lot of the finger pointing here, and before my 6 years in India, I spent 8 years living in Russia. I'm a Russianist by background. Actually, Russia has had its own experience of people contesting elections in that country. You only have to look at the 1996 elections in Russia, where Gennady Zhukhanov almost came to power as the leader of the Communist Party. He was defeated not by Yeltsin, he was defeated because there was a concentration of very senior and very rich oligarchs, the Khodorkovskys and Berezovskys of this world, who came together and essentially funded his electoral campaign and sat him in front of a camera and helped him to perform. In some cases, helped to take away the vodka bottle that he was consuming in vast quantities at the time. So I think it really depends on how you define uncertainty, whether actually that electoral process has actually been hacked with a malicious objective in mind, or whether it's simply a symptom of a very vibrant and pluralistic political process.
Thank you, thank you. So we've got about 25 minutes left, and I want to keep this a very engaged dialogue back and forth. I see one hand in the back, but I also promised the three who we didn't get in the beginning. So I see you, gentlemen, and beware, I'm also going to give the panelists a chance if they choose to pose questions to the audience. So if there's questions you want from this diverse crowd, their thoughts, please feel free to send questions the other way. But for starters, I have the gentleman on the far right. I had someone else in the middle. Was it you, sir, who had your hand up before? And then, sir, you did. So I'll take those three first if their questions are still available, and then we'll come to the gentleman with the microphone fourth. Please, and please do identify yourself and your organization.
I'm Bose from the Center for Land Warfare Studies. One aspect about this influence operation means, if I could use the word, extremely elegant influence operation. Whoever planned it didn't plan just one particular aspect of it. He planned every component of the ecosystem.
Sir, you're saying this operation. Can you specifically?
Yeah, I'm talking about the presidential elections.
The United States?
Yes,
and
the US presidential elections. Means it's just not attacking a mailbox, or means influencing an electoral voting machine, or influencing the votes in the swing states or anything like that. He affected every portion of it. That's what I wanted to bring out. As a result, if you try to address any particular aspect of it, there's always a scope that you affect the other parameters and finally bring the influence to bear at the end result. And another very interesting aspect of it was the crowdsourced analysis of the actions of the attackers. I'm sure the attackers had not expected this kind of a crowdsourced analysis of whatever their actions were. As a result, I feel that the actions of the attackers lost a huge amount of credibility because of the huge analysis that was taking place all over the world. So these were my two observations.
Thank you. I think your part about the crowdsourcing is very interesting, and it makes me wonder, is the citizenry itself responsible for protecting its own democracy and revealing these kind of activities? Just a thought out there. The two gentlemen before, please come to the microphones if your questions are still available. So I'll start here on the right because he's first, and we'll come to that gentleman.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to India. Do you think that this election has seen the death of impartial media? This election means US election. Of course, in India, we are also facing this issue, but we are a very tolerant country, as we all know. We can handle this for 10 years. Okay. So I guess US voters have three contenders. One is Mr. Trump, and second is Clinton, and third, I assume, is CNN. US voters are losing confidence in their major mainstream news sources and turning instead to social media like Facebook and Twitter. Sir, Americans has never had more access to so much information about the candidate. Can you explain, or rather discuss, the role of in bringing back the check and balances? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take the third question, and then we'll let the panelists respond to them as a group. And then, sir, you'll be the first of our next round of questions. Please.
Thank you. You know, you talked of a set of balances. You said freedom of expression, censorship, and new kind of balances need to be addressed in this. And I think there is one more balance which needs to be addressed when we are talking of cyber attacks, and that is the balance between overt and covert. Because I think when we heard Carl Bill talk about the fact that influence operations have been there in the past as well, I think there was a much clearer line between overt and covert, and there was a balance that was drawn. I think with this, we are still struggling to find a balance, particularly in view of the complexity, speed, etc., etc. Which leads me to my second point. In view of the speed and complexity, your first effort has to be actually your defense in terms of denial, because your offensive capability is for tomorrow or day after tomorrow, after identification. So your first line actually has to be defense in denial.
Thank you. And to your point about overt, covert, I personally agree with you, and that's in fact something that I discuss at length in the article in Digital Debates. But for the rest of the points about the balancing and everything else, I'd like to go to the panelists for their thoughts on those three questions. Jane, maybe to you first.
Yeah, so I'm less enamored of this bright line between overt and covert. Hiding in plain sight is one of the most effective ways of achieving results. And is that covert or is it overt? I don't know. I really want to address this question of confidence in the media, and has social media taken the place of traditional media, and what's its role in elections and in helping inform a public in a vibrant democracy where a diversity of views is a hallmark. I think it's true. I think there is a collapse of trust in the media. Part of the campaign that President Trump ran on appealed to people who were really questioning, why should I believe what I read in the Washington Post? Why should I believe what I read in the New York Times? And it's a very legitimate question. And the media has a job to do in reminding people the role that they play. We can no longer take it for granted that people understand what the role of a free and open media is in a diverse society, because so much is at stake. Very often when people say, well, you know, when they disagree with something, they say, we really don't understand it. Well, they understand it perfectly well. They don't like it. And there are very few ways in which we can reconcile those tensions when we just have very serious disagreements. The media plays a role for us in that regard. And it plays it not only in elections, but maybe most importantly in elections. How has social media come to substitute? We're self-curating our news. We're reinforcing our own biases and our own impulses and our own thoughts and our own preconceived ideas with the media that we select in Twitter or on Facebook or in any other online platform. And we really need to do a self-assessment. And back to Sean's question, yes, the people, we the people, are the first, the vanguard of the defense of our democracy. And we better get on our horse.
Yeah, to complement what Jane just said, it's also the volume of information that we get. It's overwhelming, and it's changed in the last 15 or 20 years. People now get a like-minded media source that goes beyond the borders of their own city, their own country, their own state. There's a global draw of information, or more importantly, I think more accurately, a global push of information to individuals and citizens. And they sort of self-select to what they want to hear.
Just to continue the media discussion, as it were, before turning to the discussion on attribution, I think it's quite important to first understand that we're scratching the surface here on a very wide range of academic thought to explain disenchantment of society today. Part of that disenchantment in society is reflected in the media. Some of it might be due to historical forces, and some of it might also be due to actors specifically trying to get that disenchantment. I recommend to all of you a book, for instance, called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, that was written by a former Russian propagandist who is now in New York, who describes effectively what he considers to be, from his point of view, the propaganda campaign by the Kremlin over the last 10 years, which seeks to accomplish one thing, and that is to further the idea of a plurality of truths. that there are no objective truths anymore whatsoever. This might be a historical trend. This has nothing to do particularly with one actor developing it, but he asserts that there is a campaign to accentuate this lack of trust in individual sources of information. Everybody is bad, nobody is good, who are you therefore to judge? That's the outcome, effectively, that is implied both in this book but also in general. What that also means is that everybody starts questioning the complicity of the media. Which media is free? Who is independent? Who is true? And I think this comes back to the fundamental question that Sean raised at the beginning about freedom altogether. Now, anyone who has small children will have explained to them at one point that freedom is not absolute in any circumstance. There is no, you can't run around naked on the street. I'm sorry, that's not what freedom means. And therefore, we should be very careful about applying this lack of ambiguity to our discussion, for instance, on media or in democracy or everywhere else. Of course, there's special interests in play. There always are. The question is how dominant they are. And I think this is being overstated time and time again. Also, by the way, in terms of how influential perhaps the Russians were on the US presidential election. There's also a special interest that perhaps has been overstated. So I think we keep on coming back to certain aspects that might be part of a historical trend, the historical trend of a slowly decreasing trust in existing institutions. Some of it might have been directed by actors, some of it might be part of large historic forces. But in point of fact, it also might be pointing to a new rebalancing of power that we've been redescribing over the last 10, 15 years in 1980s, and then when Friedman talked about the world being flat and similar. And that is pretty much about what role networks are going to play. And when we talked about the crowdsourcing of attribution, for instance, in the 2016 election, that is actually an example for that. I think there was undeniably an influence operation at play, and it undeniably was such that it could be uncovered by non-state actors using not very sophisticated means, which basically shows that it wasn't as clever as it should have been, which also basically shows that nobody can really plan that far ahead in this domain. Nobody has a master plan. You can think 1 or 2 steps ahead, but this is such a complex environment. Something is going to change that is probably going to make all your dubious calculations on being able to manipulate wider media opinion invalid. And therefore, we should probably keep on coming back to one very basic principle, and that's the principle I keep on talking about, which is transparency. Because I do think transparency does play a vital role. I don't think it's a question of, you get to find out all my information, I get to find out none of yours. I think we're talking about something very concrete. And when we talk about, for instance, transparency, even taking, for instance, what the Chinese government has recently been doing. Now, the Chinese government might have been moving in a direction that doesn't seem less authoritarian than it was similar, but it's being a lot more transparent about it. We actually know now when they're implementing the IT law or similar activities what they have in mind. When they set up a cyber command, for instance, they talk about it in the media, and we have roughly an idea what those capabilities are about. So while they might not be moving in a direction that is less at odds with Western strategic direction, it is actually more transparent, more understandable, and less risk of inadvertent escalation or accidental war. So I really think transparency really serves an important function here, and it will also help counter perhaps what is a larger historical narrative altogether.
Thank you. James, did you want to weigh on this, or should we go back to the audience?
Let's get ask the audience.
All right. We'll take the 2 folks on the left here.
Hey, Abhijit, Senior Fellow at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. So, I'm sorry, Sean, but I am going to be a bit blunt. But this entire panel just comes off to me when we're talking about perceptions as a sort of elitist rant against the agency of the people, that the people are all morons. You know, RT doesn't force itself down people's throats. Nobody's forcing you to watch Mark Dice videos or follow Prison Planet on Twitter. And you know, here's the funny thing. When Ukraine happened, all the American embassy staff here used to go around saying, well, you know, the people have agency. And suddenly, when this happens to you guys in America, no, people don't have agency, and now we need to control the airwaves, and we need to tell you what's kosher and what's not. So my question is threefold. 1, what about the agency of the people? Because news is about, very frequently, it's about self-validation. You don't go online to watch the news, you go online to reinforce your pre-existing beliefs. And that's something that happens very often in India. 2, regarding the question that the French gentleman there posed. You know, an attack being covered favors a certain candidate, and an attacker being covered favors another candidate. So if you prevent an attacker being covered, you're effectively favoring one candidate, which is also screwing up with the elections in a certain way. And finally, this really just seems to be some kind of a pseudo-academic whitewashing of electoral SAG rapes, right? That somehow a $1.6 trillion economy called Russia pulled off regime change in a $16 trillion economy called America, and you just don't like it, so now all these parameters come into play. I mean, gerrymandering wasn't an issue, but somehow, well, you know, alleged voter list manipulation is an issue. Thank you.
Please stay for 1 second. I appreciate the bluntness, and I like the challenge to our format here. Let me ask for, maybe it's a clarification or a response to you. Your agency of the people that you feel is being threatened or denied now, should that include the right to the anonymity of speech, or should the people, this agency, be allowed to know, whether posts on social media or broadcast media, who is behind that message? Or does that agency of the people that deserves protection also include protection of completely anonymous, including possibly foreign anonymous interventions in one's political system?
It's the right to choose. If I choose to trust an anonymous source, that's my right.
Okay.
Right.
So let me put that to the panel. Nearly an absolute right. If the panel's willing, I think this is a fascinating topic, and I'd love to hear a little us address it, and then we certainly will get the next question as well.
So what's interesting to me about this is we all hear with the ears we have. And I suppose it's impossible to be in this room or in this hotel without falling prey to the designation of elite. But be that as it may, I think what we're talking about explicitly is protecting individual agency here. We're talking about, you know, how do our societies succeed if our governments don't succeed? And how should our governments be put in place, if not through the agency? I mean, I said earlier on in my remarks, there is no more fundamental political right than a say in how you are governed. And I think that's basically what this conversation is all about.
So I was trying to unwrap that question a little bit, because sometimes it sounded like we were talking about an argument against Article 66A of the Indian IT law. But I just wanted to ask if that was the intent, was to talk about, if the intent was gerrymandering versus election subversion. I think the implication was here is that one considers one system to be corrupt or to be in hock to its own vested self-interests. Why should the complaint be that outside interests have interfered with it? So I think that's a question that kind of answers itself, is that you're allowed to do whatever you want to yourself. You can be as corrupt as you want with your own sovereignty, but if somebody else messes with that system or corrupts you externally, that might be a subject of concern. And corruption takes many different forms. It's not a question of presenting a narrative that is false and then effectively having an unsuspected consumer then effectively make the choice, is this true or false? But we're talking about a prolonged campaign to steer in a particular direction. That is the point here. It's not a presentation of one false fact, or the famous term that we used to use that we've avoided so far, fake news, or another. It is the question of a consistent effort to steer in one direction on the basis of falsehoods. This is the difference, by the way, between psychological operations as it is defined within many militaries in the West, for instance, and psychological operations as has been carried out, for instance, in other countries, is that you are actually supposed to obey certain principles, and that principle is that you're not allowed to mislead and you're not allowed to lie. When you break those principles, then you're not in marketing, or what in the US is called strategic communication or similar, you're into totally different territory. And I think it's important not to create false ambiguity that these are the same thing. They're not the same thing. Falsehoods are falsehoods, and intent to deceive is intent to deceive.
So I'm going to take the last question, and then I'm going to invite the panelists to respond to that question as a part of your closing comments. Over to you, sir.
I'm K.S. Park from Korea, a law professor there, also running organization, OpenNet Korea, digital rights organization. I think that we should focus on the attackers, not the attacks. The architecture of the internet is such that it's so free. I mean, just like anybody speaking English can join a dinner conversation conducted in English, any computer speaking the language of TCP/IP can join just one neighboring computer, and you are part of the internet. There is really no gatekeeper who can pre-authorize who can join the conversation or not. I think the term cybersecurity is only I think it's quite it acquired popularity only recently. I think in the wake of the Trump's election and how the Russians were implicated in it, and I think cybersecurity became the springboard for the government to increase their role on the internet, where the governments really didn't have any role because the architecture is just so open and free. So why are we talking about election subversion? Only because the attack was done by state actors. If it was non-state actor Russians who just wanted to see white man as the president, they could have done their propaganda by setting up websites, by sending tweets. They can do whatever they want. There is no cybersecurity event there. It's because it is done by the state actor. We are seeing a cybersecurity event. Korea, I mean, this is a really foreign concept to you, but in Korea, NIS, our own strategic intelligence service agency, conducted cyber warfare against their own people in manipulating the election, in manipulating 2012 election. That's the election that elected the president who just got impeached. Impeached and replaced, and this is all true. I mean, this is not fake news. The chief of the former chief of NIS, who conducted the propaganda during the 2012 election, was just convicted of election subversion and sent to prison for several years. So why is there a problem? Well, because it was NIS, it was the state actor that conducted information warfare. So I think that if we're going to have any talk about international norms on cybersecurity, who will be coming to the talks? Only the state actors, right? So it is the attackers that we should be talking about. But that leaves me with a bigger question. We already established that information warfare is as old as warfare itself. So are we saying that there should be some, Geneva Convention type of restriction on the way we conduct our warfare, including information warfare? Can transparency be part of those norms? If so, I don't know. I don't know about transparent information warfare, because once we know that some tweets come from Russian government, people are not going to retweet them, right? So information warfare is going to lose all efficacy. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And Phil, can I start at this end and then we'll just work down?
Yeah, just to wrap up briefly. So to focus on the attackers means you actually have to do something. Who's going to go do that? Who's going to go against those big countries to actually take action that has some meaningful effect? It requires an offensive role. Our business is going to do that. Our NGOs, our civil society going to be able to do that. But one thing that we all can do by focusing on the attack is take defensive action. We can share that information, the method of the attack, the technical data, the methods of what type of sophisticated encryption that they did. We can share that information, and we can share it openly and freely. So focusing on the attack, it's a defensive thing in nature. We can share that information, we can be better. And we'll build coalitions and strength through we're all feeling the effect of an attacker. But when you have to identify an attack, you have to name and shame, and you actually have to do something. You can all boast about going after a big nation state, whether it be America, Antarctica, Canada, but at some point you have to do something. Where's the political will in that today? To do something where it's very difficult and complicated to explain a technical attack to citizens. It's going to be hard to do. So let's all be better. We can be better defensively, and by being better defensively, we can up our game and be better.
So I want to stick with this theme of what do we do about it. I work for a company that makes ink and security technology for most of the world's banknotes. I recognize this audience may have a special view on that, but inherent in what we do is material security. So you can answer a very fundamental question. Is this thing what I think it is? When I was working in Homeland Security, we had a version of this question that we asked ourselves every day. Are you who you say you are? Are you who you say you are? So when it comes to voting, what can we do? In the first instance, we can establish some material security around the ballot itself, that it's legitimate. And then we can secure it through digital means. We've been talking about blockchain over the past day and a half. It has a role to play here. So at some level, election integrity does begin with the ballot itself. Can we materially secure it? The answer is yes, we can. Can we then digitally secure it? The answer is yes, we can. And the intersection of the audit of the physical and the digital can give us some confidence, greater confidence, that the ballots that were filed were legitimate and that the count that they result in is itself authentic. But it's time to address these problems in very real ways. To build on what Phil said, it's time to do something.
So I thought the last question was also a good one to conclude with, and I just want to start with a general principle, which is sometimes history is hard to recognize when you're living through it. And we are really witnessing history. The internet is changing. And the internet that we have known for the last 10, 15 years is changing. And I think it is largely to do with the activities of government, which is why I agree with the previous speaker. Indeed, the whole equivalence of cybersecurity being a government topic is an interesting one. When we talk about the difference between information security as a word and cybersecurity as a word, really one of the only differences is that cybersecurity includes concentrating on offensive action as well, which usually is only conducted legitimately by governments. So therefore, it was a very good question, and it brings me to the point that when we talk about information warfare and information operations conducted by states, we have to be aware of what this might do to the internet per se. And we have to realize that the internet per se, what we've been using for the last 10 years, has worked pretty well so far. It has a lot of faults to it, there's a lot of things wrong with it, but ripping the whole thing down and building a new one, or changing the fundamental principles which it runs on, which is the interest of some actors, is going to serve only their interest and nobody else's. And it's very important to consider that in information warfare, we do have, especially regarding the internet observer principle. The way we deal with the internet, the way we talk about it, the way we effectively discuss security issues on it, will change our perception of it. And we're moving towards a direction where government is slowly getting the universal legitimacy to tell us how the internet should be run. We're moving away from the multi-stakeholder model that has built and maintained the internet the last 20 years, 25 years for the World Wide Web, and moving towards a model where governments will have the final say. And I think information warfare plays a defining role in this changing narrative. It might be an inadvertent outcome, it might not be the purpose of it, but this is where we're going. And we should be very much aware of what the end result will be. And finally, I just want to make one point. As a cyber person, I was a cyber person now, but I was a script kiddie hacker beforehand. Every script kiddie hacker knows what you really want to do, the ultimate hack, is at the top level, is at the level where I ask you to do something, you simply do it. Going through a hole in the code, going through tapping your cables, all these things are just simply detours. The ultimate hack is always psychological, and we have to be very, very careful that when we engage in narratives, we're not falling prey to exactly that type of hack.
Thank you. And I think I would just very simply add, hopefully to complement what's already been said, that I think companies, from a corporate point of view, do need to know who their threat actors are. They do need to know their methods. They do need to know their techniques. But they need to know that so that they can then build a proportionate response in the policies and the controls and the technical solutions that they put in place within their own organizations, rather than use that as a spur to then go after those that are attacking them. So it's very much about prevention. It's about that prevention being proportionate to the threat. And I think it's also more broadly about making sure that you're building the right stakeholder relationships. I think we see lots of examples of where companies come under attack, but because they've built the right stakeholder relationships in government and within industry, that they have the right channels to identify people who can actually act for them, who can advocate for them, rather than just focusing the whole time on their foes. So for example, in an Indian context, that could be any number of the different federal or state level agencies, and including the DSCI and NASCOM and other agencies like them. I think that kind of stakeholder mapping and engagement is as important as also making sure that you're putting prevention at the forefront of everything that you do.
Well, thank you very much, all of you. That brings us to the end of our time. I would like to thank the audience for your attention and your active engagement, and invite you to join me in thanking our panelists as well.